mysterious. Let's get right into the first story. This one comes to us from Valerie. She says, "The craziest thing about this sighting was the location in which it occurred. Considering all the areas in Yosemite that one would consider desolate and lightly traveled, the Brattlevale Trail would not be one of them. This particular trail is predominantly hardpack, with very little elevation change or anything else for that matter. There are a decent amount of rock climbers in the area and a fair amount of foot traffic from all kinds of people who want to see the falls. In fact, a lot of single chicks come here in hopes of increasing their chances of marriage, according to the Indian legend. At any rate, Carol and I were relatively alone this day in May of 2007 when we were working our way down the trail. The two of us have been on this trail numerous times, as we have on many of the trails in Yosemite. We were coming up on an area where there's a creek that's strewn so heavily with boulders that it's hard to even say it's a creek. As we were approaching, we heard the sound of a large rock cracking down on top of some other rocks. There was no question in our minds whatsoever as to what we had heard, and we knew it was coming from the creek. I don't think it was but 15 seconds later we heard yet another sound of boulders tumbling against each other, like we had the first time. The two of us were very unsure as to what we were about to walk up on, and began to slow our roll, gradually coming up to where the sound was emanating from. As we were closing in on the creek, we heard yet another large cracking sound of a boulder tumbling. Now, this really had our attention because the boulders in this creek are more than likely in 15-pound plus range. Some of them are probably over 100 pounds or more. And this is a boulder field with water running through it. Who or what was tossing boulders around is anyone's guess at this point. We crept up to the point where we could now turn our heads to the right, viewing the creek. There are a lot of low-lying trees in here, of quite a few varieties. The creek has some trees growing upright through the boulders and is enveloped somewhat like a tunnel by trees on both sides. In the direction we were looking, the creek and boulder field meandered into the trees about 75 feet away from where we were crouched. It was almost the apex of where the creek disappeared to the left into the trees that we saw a Sasquatch. The creature was standing directly under an area of the canopy where the sun was shining brightly on its back. It was standing on an angle where we were seeing its back and left arm in a hunched over position. It was holding what appeared to be a very heavy rock, like it was nothing. It then flipped this boulder to its side and kind of knelt down, reaching into the water with its hand. It seemed to be feeling around in the creek, and then it put its hand to its mouth. Thankfully, it wasn't facing towards us. For only a few moments later, it took a step and it picked up another boulder, flipped it to the side, and bent down to reach into the creek again. This time it used its left hand, which we could see, and it put it to its mouth. The creature was about 100 feet away from us, but because of the size of its hands and the smallness of whatever it was grabbing, we couldn't see anything. Mind you, I couldn't believe that the two of us had even stayed there for this amount of time and not run away. It was just a few seconds later that we heard some people talking and laughing coming up the trail from where we had. As soon as we heard the noise, the Sasquatch turned its head quickly to its right, which, again, was not looking at all at us, and took a couple of quick steps into the trees and was gone. About 2 minutes later, these three dudes came walking up on us and said, "How you girls doing today?" Carol said to him, "You dudes just scared off a Bigfoot." They were like, "No way, man. Are you kidding me?" Then Carol said, "Way, bro. He was just standing right there, flipping boulders around and eating something. As soon as you dudes started laughing back there, he heard you and split." The one dude said, "I'm so sorry, man. Where was he?" I told him, "Don't be sorry, because we were more than likely 10 seconds away from running out of here. You actually did us a favor." Then one of these guys walked up to where the Sasquatch had been. He was trying his best not to break his neck on the rocks. When we watched this dude trying to make his way back to where the Sasquatch was and how hard it was, it made me realize how easy the Sasquatch had done it. It was no chore at all for him to move around in these boulders. This dude tried to pick up some of the rocks, and we thought he would drop a nut in the process. The Bigfoot was picking them up and holding them while he was looking around in the water. Just after that, this guy said that there was a Bigfoot print right next to the creek where he was standing. Eventually, he made his way back over by us, and they left. This thing was at least 8 or 9 feet tall, from what we could guess, and it was picking up these huge rocks like it was holding a football. It looked like they were no effort at all. The hair in the direct sunlight was reddish blonde, and the blonde could have very well been white or even gray. The sun was so bright on its back that it was actually creating a glare. It was actually a hard thing to take in as we watched. I was kind of in a stupor, like I was waiting to wake up from a dream. It's very hard to explain, but that's the way it was. For the time that we were watching, it felt like I was in a trance. I say that because I can't even believe that the two of us were able to just sit there and not run. I have no idea how this type of thing can even be in this area and stay out of sight. It's not like we're in some big dark rainforest, and yet there it was. Yeah, no kidding. How the heck do you just sit there and watch it? 100 feet away? That's not too far away. And then those dudes, they must not have believed him, because why the heck would they walk down there to the rocks right where that Bigfoot was just a second ago? If only they knew what they were getting themselves into, potentially. Well, let's move on to the next one. Before we do, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button for me. Appreciate y'all. This one comes to us from Gladys. She writes, "My husband is long since passed, but at the time the two of us were taking a canoe trip down the Chattahoochee for the day. We'd begun the journey in the morning from the Jones Bridge, with our end goal being the Chattahoochee River Park. Depending on the river level and how much paddling you want to do or not, this trip, which we've done before, can take somewhere between 9 and 12 hours. Time was about 5:30 in the morning. We were about 2 hours into the float when we began to slowly drift around the bend in the river. On the bank to our left, my husband and I saw a large blue heron taking a fish from the shallows and swallowing it whole. The two of us put our binoculars to our eyes in order to watch the bird. We had our eyes fixed on this bird for probably 2 minutes as the canoe continued to drift in the current. When I finally had taken my glasses down and looked ahead over the river, no sooner had I turned my head than my eyes became fixed on what appeared to be 2 figures standing on a shoal on the river's edge. At that moment, I didn't realize that I was looking at one small creature and the larger one bent over at the waist. Both of them had their backs turned to us in the canoe. My husband still had his binoculars fixed on the heron. when I whispered to him, "Look." The current was pulling us along at a pretty good clip, and we were gaining on whatever these creatures were fairly rapidly. When I first saw them, we were more than likely 200 yards away and closing. When the larger one straightened up, and I now knew it was large, it twisted its upper torso to the left. I realized later that I was looking at the breast on its chest, which I didn't fully comprehend at the moment. When she had turned to the left, she must have caught a glimpse of us in her peripheral vision, because what had initially started out as a very casual movement suddenly turned very fast as she fully turned to look at us. This larger creature, which we both realized later was a Bigfoot, reached down quickly, grabbing a hold of the little one, picking it up like a mother holding a small child, and she took about 3 or 4 steps and was gone from sight into the trees on the bank. It was only maybe 2 minutes later when the drift had brought us right to the spot where they'd been sitting. We used the paddles to hold our position and take a good look at where they had been. We could now see that there was in fact a shallow water shoal through the maybe 1 foot of water. It was evident that she'd been digging around in the river bottom, possibly for some fresh crustaceans or the like. I have no idea, but the bottom was definitely disturbed in a number of areas. As we looked into the trees, we could see nothing of the 2 Bigfoot, but the trees were so dense at this point that they could have been right there hiding, and we would have been unable to see them due to the vegetation along the river's edge being extremely thick and lush. It was after the fact that I came to the conclusion that the smaller one must have been no more than 3 feet tall or so. At that height, he didn't reach the level of the mother's waist when she was bent fully downward. It was at least a foot or more shy of that level. When the mother had stood up and fully turned to see us, it was then that I had a good look at both of the breasts and knew that it was a female and its babe. The mother was easily well over twice the height of the little one, making her some 7 or 8 feet tall. The mother's body was large and yet very cylindrical in its shape. From the width of its thighs to the width of its upper chest, I would have to say that it was about 3 feet wide, and as I say, very uniform in its dimensions. The youngster's hair was almost black in its coloration, whereas the mother was more of an auburn or reddish color. The sun being very bright, there was absolutely no variation or guessing involved as to what exactly we were looking at. It was definitely 2 Bigfoot, one great and one small. As we sat in the canoe looking over the shoal into the woods, I could now see that she had taken only several strides to cover almost 20 feet in order to exit the river, and that with the juvenile in her grasp, of course now having done much research and snooping around to learn what others have seen in regards to these creatures, I must say that this female was in no way in appearance as those said to be like bodybuilders. You could evidently see that she was powerful as a bear, if not more so, but did not give the appearance of being a muscle-bound beast by any means. She was just thickly bodied and very burly, and I'm sure that she could dispatch you or me or anyone else if you messed with her cub. That's what we saw on that day on the Chattahoochee River. First of all, as embarrassed as I am to say so, I fall under the category of many who, for reasons believed to be true or not, do not want my name or identity to be linked with Bigfoot. In the professional world, my opinion is that it could do me more harm than good. For that, I do apologize, but my family and livelihood come first and foremost. I believe for this reason, and this reason alone, thousands of people like myself have never reached out or come forward with what they've seen or experienced in regards to this creature. Nevertheless, I'm here to share what it is that I did see, and I did see it for whatever it's worth. among other things, I run a professional, licensed drone survey business. My business is involved mainly in the inspection of power transmission systems, such as power lines, wind turbines, and oil transfer systems, like our network of pipelines nationally. Due to the nature of my business, I can find myself in some very desolate and lonely areas of North America in the course of my reporting and investigating. Without giving up any more information about my operation than I have to, the drone that I was using that day has a flight time of about 25 minutes, and I can fly at speeds that approach 50 miles an hour. It was last year in the Midwest United States that I was hired to do some close-up photography of a string of high-voltage wire towers. In years past, individual men with large cherry-picker trucks had to go tower to tower to do the visual inspections that I now do with my drone. I'm typically looking to film oil leakage, bearing water, bird nests, pipe leaks, and a host of other things that may be indicative of a team of needing to come out to the location and do a formal inspection and/or repair. Generally speaking, I drive in alone, as close as possible to where I'm working, and then the drone takes to the air. I will typically do a fairly good inspection and then move on with my truck to close in on another area. In other words, I kind of hopscotch with my truck, and the drone fills in what's in between. On this particular day, in 2017, I was inspecting a run of power transmission poles. The section I was working on had been cut through a large swath of forest, with the terrain being somewhat like rolling hills. I had parked my Ford and began my inspection. The drone was about a mile out, going over a hill, out of my sight momentarily. When I get close to a tower, I move in tight and do a fly around, looking at all the connections for anything unusual. In between towers, I generally fly above the wires where I can get a good look at what's ahead, including the ground below. At the point which I'm about to share with you, I had about 12 minutes of flight time left, including about 6 minutes to fly the drone safely back to my location. I must add that this drone is so quiet that I could hover above you on your picnic table and you would have no idea that I was there above you. I was on my way to the next pole, flying above the lines about 300 feet, when my ground camera picks up on a huge Bigfoot walking along the trail which the lines are constructed on, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I dropped in altitude to about 150 feet. I had an incredible bird's eye view of this thing as it was walking along. I'd only been following it for a few minutes when I had to bring the drone back. As soon as the drone was secured, I jumped in the truck and took off up to the point where the drone had gone over the hill out of my sight. I parked just below the crest of the hill and relaunched the drone with a fresh battery pack in hopes of catching the Bigfoot further down the trail. Just a few minutes later, there he was. I couldn't believe how much ground he had covered since I last saw him. True to form, this creature had no idea it was being surveilled from above. At one point, I shifted the drone to maybe 50 feet left of the Bigfoot, but at a higher altitude. I didn't want to risk for one split second that he would see the drone, for whatever reason, get spooked. I could also see from the air that he was leaving numerous tracks in some of the softer areas of sand and soil on the trail. The creature was massive, and from above, it looked like the comic book character, the Hulk. It was a muscle-bound monster in every sense of the word. The upper body, including its arms and torso, were pumping along as though it had so much muscle it couldn't relax its posture. Picture Mr. Universe times 5 or more. That's what I was seeing. Its head was plugged into the very level of its shoulders. On 2 or 3 occasions, I observed it looking slightly to its left or right, and the entire upper body moved to do so for the most part. It appeared that the creature did not possess the same mobility that we humans do. Whether or not they're all like this is anyone's guess. All that I know is what I saw this one doing. Sadly, once again, the clock was working against me and I had to cut my surveillance short, bringing the drone back to the truck, and the sighting was over. As soon as I had the drone back safely, I hopped in the truck and went over the hill. The creature was miles away from me at this point, according to my estimation. This Bigfoot had walked casually somewhere between 1.5 to 2 miles in a little over 10 minutes. I knew this to be true once the drone was back on top of it the second time. When I got over the hill, I was riding with the window open and looking at the ground for tracks, which I came upon very quickly. Now I'm 5'10", and I had no idea what my stride was at the time, but it took almost 3 excessive, long, exaggerated steps of my own to equal one of the Bigfoots. The other thing that was immediately evident was that all of its steps were in single file. In other words, one foot placed directly in front of the other over and over again. The Bigfoot's body was covered predominantly in thick hair, not fur. For the most part, it appeared like longer hair on the head of a man or woman, maybe between 4 and 10 inches long, depending on what part of the body that we're talking about. Its face from the side, as well as its hands, were almost entirely black, or extremely dark. Its feet also had overlapping hair hanging off the sides. I understand now, more than ever, the gut-wrenching feeling of knowing that this thing is real, and having no outlet to talk about it. That is to say, without fear of ridicule relating to what I've seen. As a professional and having worked very hard throughout my life, I simply can't risk having the wrong person say the wrong things about me. It may leave me on the outside looking in with regards to my work life, and so I say nothing. It is my opinion, now that these things have been known about for a long time, especially in our day and age with the advanced night vision optics and thermal used by military on the ground and in the air. That and all the tactical infrared. There is no way these things are not being picked up on and seen on a regular basis. That's my opinion, and I voice it as such. Curtis begins. This sighting occurred under the most unusual of circumstances imaginable, in my opinion. It was July of 2005 that my wife had surprised me with a hot air balloon ride as part of my birthday gift. I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it when I opened the envelope and saw what it was, but what else was I going to say except thanks? I should tell you that I and heights don't get along well, which is something that my new bride was not exactly aware of at the time. For 3 weeks, I was biting my nails and waited for the day of the ride to arrive. It was a Tuesday morning, and we'd made our way over to a large field in the countryside where the balloonist team was waiting for us. The balloon was massive in its dimensions, and I have to tell you that standing alongside of it was actually quite impressive. The owner-operator, whose name was Bob, told us that its panels consisted of every color in the rainbow, and, my God, it was spectacular. The day was somewhat cloudy, but Bob told us that the conditions were perfect, as far as flying a balloon goes. While my wife was chatting it up with one of the ground crew, I stepped aside and asked Bob if we'd be all right to limit our height as we flew. He just laughed and said, "When we're at a good level for you, you just give me a wink, and I'll know what you mean." So my wife and I, and 4 other people who we just met, climbed into the gondola as the ropes were let go and we began flight. After about the first 15 minutes or so, I was beginning to calm down a little, trying to do some deep breathing without letting anyone else know what I was doing. This was actually quite funny, in that about 20 minutes later, I was helping to calm down a woman who was herself getting a little anxious. We were going over many farm fields that were bordered by woodlands. After a while, we approached an area that was mostly woods. The pilot, Bob, had been holding the balloon at a steady 500 feet in altitude for my sake, and nobody had complained or said anything about it whatsoever. I was actually starting to enjoy myself. As we now found ourselves going over what Bob said was a hill, he said that he was going to have a little fun and bring us down to treetop level. The balloon was actually kind of neat to see in operation. I think there was flaps that could let hot air out, allowing it to descend. And then, of course, when he wanted to gain a little altitude, he just turned the burner on to create some more hot air with the balloon. We descended to a level where we were just barely skimming over the tops of the trees. And then suddenly, we brushed them, and everyone in the balloon started to cheer and laugh. We were making such a racket that you'd think we'd won the lottery. But it was all in good fun. Bob then allowed the balloon to gain a little more altitude once again. He allowed the balloon to descend back down to treetop level, and at this point, we were almost to the edge of the hill's bottom, which was also close to where this tract of woods ended. Now where this woods ended, abutted with what I'll call either a wheat field or some kind of field that was resting in between crops with something tall growing in it. Bob once again lowered the balloon, scraping the trees, and we all erupted once again in cheers and laughter. Suddenly, one of the ladies said, "Oh my God, will you look at that?" I was actually looking at what she saw when she said what she did. At this point, we were only maybe 70 or 80 feet off the ground, having just brushed the trees, and we couldn't have been at a better vantage point. A tremendous Bigfoot had come bursting out of the forest perimeter, apparently having been frightened by the balloon hitting the trees and our screaming. He'd come out into the field in a very fast walk, which would have been running for you and me. He was moving at an angle toward our right-hand side, and we had no way of steering the balloon to follow him. As the creature was walking, he turned to look up at us over his left-hand shoulder. Then, he hit the ground, galloping away on all fours, like a greyhound in a race. The only time I ever saw an animal move like that was at the Belmont Stakes horse race. In my opinion, he was actually faster than a horse. The sad thing was that he'd run across the field into a narrow band of trees that was bordering it. Eventually, he would have come out and exposed himself again. However, since we were drifting in the balloon, we would not be there to see him. One of the ladies in the balloon said she thought she got a good photo of this thing running away. She actually forwarded it to me and my wife later on, and quite frankly, it wasn't very good at all. That actually brings up another funny point relative to Bigfoot sightings. Everybody in that gondola had a camera, and in the heat of the excitement, only one person squeezed off a shot, and by then it was too late. I can tell you this much from experience, having been through this now for myself. The utter shock and excitement when something like this occurs is beyond description. I would compare it to awakening from a nightmare when for a few moments you're just trying to clear your mind and gather your thoughts. This was the same in that you momentarily can't think straight and you temporarily lose your decision-making abilities. At any rate, when this creature came out of the woods, it was just to the right-hand side of where I'd been looking. I only had to shift my eyes and was looking directly at it. It was huge and bulky. I could see its muscles moving below its fur. You know how weightlifters can flex their pectoral muscles and make them kind of dance around, for lack of a better word? With every movement that this creature made, its muscles were just banging around on its body. It was really remarkable to see firsthand. As it turned its head over its shoulder to look up at the balloon briefly before dropping to all fours, I actually believe it looked right at me. I could see that its face was dark gray with black lines in it, and its fur was just slightly darker than, say, like a blonde grizzly bear, if you've ever seen one. It had relatively long and straight hair that almost, as crazy as it sounds, looked like it was brushed. It appeared to be fairly clean and actually, all things considered, quite a beautiful thing to behold. As you can imagine, nobody cared what the balloon was doing or not doing anymore. We were all absolutely giddy about what we'd just collectively seen. To date, this is the absolute craziest thing that has ever happened to me in my life, and I thought I'd share it with you. My wife and I had been living in the Portland, Maine area for about 10 years when a piece of property with a nice home on it was brought up to our attention by a mutual friend. This home was located a considerable distance to our north in the area of Moosehead Lake, which is one of the most beautiful regions of the state. After having gone and inspected the property, the two of us had decided to make the move. This was a beautiful older home that was only a short ride away from the southern portion of the lake near Greenville. Now, my wife and I are big into gardening, so we spend a fair amount of our time out and about in the yard. We typically have many tools and such leaning against the shed and laying here and there around the property. It was about the middle of summer when the two of us had gotten sick of telling each other that we'd misplaced something. We were constantly blaming each other whenever a tool could not be found. We decided to gather everything together, as far as our yard tools were concerned, and do an accounting of our inventory. After counting the tools, we determined that we were missing a 4-pronged rake, 2 spades, lopping shears, and 3 small hand shovels. Now trust me when I tell you that there was nobody visibly around us or our yard at any time of day or night, unless they snuck in unaware. When we realized that neither of us was to blame, the question now arose, who exactly was? It was then that my wife and I decided to call the police and file a report about the stolen property, as well as the possibility of a prowler of some sort being around. An officer showed up a short while later and took our report. All of us were in agreement, as we looked around the property, that we were in a fairly secluded area that would seem very odd for a thief to come around here. To steal a garden tool? At any rate, the officer filed the report and told us to keep in touch if there were any further activity in regards to the theft. I guess this would be a good time to tell you that we were right in the thick of things as far as the forest goes. Our property consisted of a cleared 5-acre lot that was virtually surrounded on all sides, with the exception of the driveway, by thick Maine forest. I'll also mention that our driveway was about 600 feet long and connected directly to a main road. After replacing most of the stolen tools with new ones, we had decided to keep all the tools in the shed, with the exception of 2 small garden shovels that were used more regularly. These 2 small handheld shovels were left lying on a marble-topped bistro-style pedestal table on our patio, the table that we regularly used for potting plants and other things. It was about 2 weeks after the officer had come to take our report of missing items that my wife came in from the backyard and said that both of the shovels were gone. The two of us went outside and were basically standing there scratching our heads as to what was going on with these tools. For whatever reason, we started to take a walk into the woods in the hopes of finding or seeing some type of clues regarding these tools. We must have been walking around for about an hour when my wife said, "Hey, check this out. There's a long-handled spade." As sure as my name is Lyle, there was our spade leaning against a tree in the woods. Not that we needed any confirmation, but all of our long-handled tools had a red band of paint that we applied to the handles. it didn't end there. And in fact, things got a little weirder. As we continued our walk, my wife once again said, "Oh my God, Lyle, look at that." She was pointing up on an angle at a tree just ahead of us, and there it was. One of our small potting shovels was stuck in the side of a tree about 9 feet off the ground. It appeared to be buried into the trunk several inches. Now, this little shovel was made of one piece of billet aluminum that had a black rubber handle for comfort. Just so you can understand, the edges on these are not sharp at all. In fact, they're rather blunt, maybe being about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch thick, and having a slight curvature to the business end of the tool. And yet, this tool was stuck into the tree several inches and high above our heads. My wife and I walked all the way back to the house to retrieve a 6-foot stepladder as well as our camera, and walked back out to where the shovel was stuck in the tree. I opened up the ladder up next to the tree, and as my wife held it, I climbed up and tried to remove the shovel. Now, this tree was a large oak, and I could now see, being right on top of it, that the shovel was in a good 3 inches. I couldn't budge it so much as making it move to the slightest. We took a picture of it, and having made our way back home, we once again called the police. I should also tell you that we left the ladder in place by the tree so the policeman could see for himself what we were talking about. The time frame here is critical, so let me spell it out for you. It took us 10 minutes to get back to the house, and it was about another hour before the officer arrived. We talked at the house for about 10 minutes, and then it took us all of about another 10 or 15 minutes to get back out to where the shovel was in the tree. So, the total time we had been gone was about an hour and a half. As we were now nearing where we were sure we had been, my wife and I were looking, of course, for the folding 6-foot stepladder, the ladder we had left set up alongside of the tree. We were more than perplexed in that we could not find it. Now, there was nothing unusual about the tree, which had the shovel stuck into it. In fact, there were hundreds of this same type of tree. We seemed to be walking in circles when my wife, in her eagle eyes, yet again spied out the shovel stuck in the tree. Yet the ladder was nowhere to be found. You can just imagine the facial expressions of this policeman as the three of us are now standing in the woods, looking at this shovel stuck 9 feet up above our heads in a tree, and a couple of us saying that the ladder, which we just left set up for him, was now missing also. He stood under the tree shaking his head as to who or what could have shoved a garden shovel into a tree like that. He also took note of the fact that the handle's end had not been beaten with anything, such as a hammer. He now fully believed us about the missing ladder. We were all looking around for any type of clues on the ground and could find nothing, so back to the house we went. The policeman said that he was going to turn this over to a detective for further investigation, which he did. And the very next morning, my wife was outside amending some of the vegetables in the garden soil with some manure. In case you're not a gardener, the whole manure thing can make your yard a little stinky for a few days, and our yard was in fact stinky. That afternoon, the detective came by, and we walked him back into the woods to see the shovel. As he stood there, he was baffled, as the three of us had been the day before, as to how the shovel could come to where it was, and why all of our tools had gone missing. Lyle and I knew that there was nothing they could really do, shy of catching someone red-handed. The detective left, having made the usual run-of-the-mill comments regarding the incident. It was 2 days later that my wife had gone out to the backyard to tend to the garden in her usual way. The garden she had freshly manured was penned in with 6-foot-tall chicken wire and measured 15 feet by 25 feet. His garden was comprised of half tomatoes and half lettuce, and the tomatoes were on the vine, so to speak. On one corner, there was a gate made of 2x4s with chicken wire stapled to them. The gate had a simple stockade fence type of clasp on it with no lock. The supports for the wire surrounding the garden, with the exception of where the gate was built, were the long flat metal stakes used to support the snow fencing. These were driven into the ground with a mallet type of device, and afterwards we wired the fencing to them. A few minutes after she'd gone out the back door, she came bursting back in the house yelling, "Honey, you have to come out here and take a look at this." We went out the door to find a section of the chicken wire was collapsed to the ground and the gate was still closed. We stood there looking at the damage, and our eyes immediately were drawn to what was a large amount of huge footprints within the garden soil. Looking at the plants, the tomatoes had been ransacked. There wasn't a single tomato left on the vines, be they green or ripened. The prints were enormous and had virtually flattened the majority of the bed. Almost every head of lettuce that had been growing was smashed. I had gone into the house to retrieve a tape measure. The footprints measured some 20 inches long, and at their widest point, being the toes, 11 inches. They were in the same shape of a gigantic human-like foot. We immediately called the detective, who left us a card, and he showed up some 2 hours later. When he entered the yard and saw for himself what we described on the phone, he was momentarily speechless. When he broke the silence, he said, "I believe these are the footprints of a Bigfoot. As crazy as that may sound." He said that they do get reports of such creatures in the state from time to time, but never had he imagined that he would be looking down on such evidential proof. The detective continued, "Everything makes sense now. Something with feet this large must have been enormous." Calls have come in through the years of people claiming to have seen these creatures ranging between 7 and 12 feet tall, crossing the streets or around their properties. This creature, be it mischievous or inquisitive, must have been grabbing your tools simply because it could, not knowing what they were for, and for whatever reason, had driven the shovel into the tree. It would also explain the height of which it was done. He said that he felt bad, but that there was nothing he could really do. He apologized and said he would pass it on to the wardens. After he left, my wife and I sat down for a little chat. We were discussing all the things that had transpired, including the notion that there was now a Bigfoot patrolling our property. The first thing that had drawn us to purchase this home was a very good price tag. The second was that the previous owners had created the garden beds that we're now using, including the one that had the tomatoes in it. The thought came to us that they had more than likely moved for the same reasons we were now going to, so we sold the house. We'd been living in Maine for quite some time and heard rumors here and there through the years of such creatures prowling about. One thing that needs to be understood about Maine is that this state is as big as the rest of New England combined. Having said that, over 90% of the state is uninhabited wilderness, where apparently everything and anything is roaming around out here, including a giant who can ram a shovel 3 inches into an oak tree. Smash that subscribe button for me if you would. This one comes to us from a man named Boone. He says, "I had moved from the Tallahassee area in 1973, and what I'm about to share with you transpired in July of 1969. I was 14 years old at the time. Back then, my dad was a heavy equipment operator involved in housing developments, building construction, demolition, damn near anything else you could think of where a piece of heavy equipment was needed. He could run a crane, a dozer, and anything in between. In the back of our house, my dad always kept several 50-gallon drums in which he put his scrap metal, one for brass, one for copper, another for aluminum, and another for wire. This was all the booty, as he used to call it, that he gathered from job sites. A friend of my father's, Mr. Davis, owned a scrapyard where I worked part-time. It was then when Mr. Davis told me how much more money I could be making in scrapping, and my eyes were opened to how much cash was laying around in the garbage and in the form of scrap metal. Now I was too young to drive, but I had a Schwinn bicycle with 3 baskets on it. That's when I decided to begin my secondary career, hunting in trash bins and garbage cans for scrap. The Vietnam War was still going on, and metals were at a premium. In fact, even as a kid, I knew that many guys were stealing radiators from cars and the like. Mr. Davis just turned a blind eye and paid up with cash. He had a small block house in the front of his yard that was buried behind the mountains of metal. That's where a couple of really creepy cats spent every day chopping crap up, so small that nobody would be able to tell what it was when it came into the yard. In other words, they were destroying the evidence. The money was pouring in and out, and it was all cash. I was getting up real early in the morning, making the rounds over the town on my bike. On garbage day, I would hit hundreds and hundreds of residential trash cans collecting metal. I kept a series of wrenches and a hacksaw on my bike to cannibalize anything and everything, including the proverbial kitchen sink. I was having a ball with my little hustle, turning over several $100s a week. In 2 months' time, I'd bought what would be my first car, which was a 1965 Fairline 500 with a 390 and a 4-speed. I paid $1,000 cash for it, and I was going to sit on it until I could drive. Aside from hitting the neighborhood cans, I began to dumpster dive around the area. A lot of people would sneak into businesses and complexes to throw large items into their dumpsters at night when nobody was around. I started to make some major finds climbing in and around these bins, but it was a dirty and nasty business. Sometimes I got more than I bargained for, finding a coon or something else in a dumpster with me upon getting in it. The other thing was, I needed to get in the dumpsters very early in the day because after the sun came up and hit the metal, they were like an oven. You couldn't even touch the metal sides without burning your hands. Now, my dad knew I was responsible at 14. I was already 6 feet tall. Every morning I got up at 4 a.m. and went around and did my rounds. I had learned my lesson several times over about opening the lid on a garbage dumpster early in the morning. On this particular morning, I was approaching a 3-dumpster compound near the rear of a large trailer park. This set of dumpsters alone usually represented a $5 or $10 hit for me every time I came to them. Now these dumpsters were set on a concrete slab in the dark, up against the woods. I always carried a couple of flashlights with me in case one broke or went dead while I was out diving. It was pretty dark as I was riding up to the site because it was cloudy and there hadn't been a moon. There was a lot of noise coming from one of the dumpsters, and the steel lid was slapping up and down. The first thing that I said to myself was that there was a damn bear inside. I turned and parked my bike about 100 feet away and picked up a couple rocks to throw at the dumpster to scare whatever was in there away. When I chucked the first rock, I hit the bin squarely, which sounded like a sledgehammer hitting the side of a steel drum. As soon as I heard the noise, The metal lid came blowing open. Out from the can, like a jack-in-the-box, jumps this screaming gorilla thing. He flew out, clearing the side of the dumpster in one clean jump. The lid came crashing down behind him. The side of the dumpster was nearly 5 feet tall and maybe 3 feet taller than the can. He was standing next to it, snorting and growling like a wild boar. The noise was so loud that lights started to go on all around from different trailers. A couple of guys actually came out of their front doors. Now I was standing in the dark next to my bike, hoping like hell this monster wasn't going to attack me. But I don't think it had time to realize that I was even there. It turned and darted away into the woods and was gone. It was maybe only a minute later when a man ran over with a flashlight and said to me, "What the hell is going on, young fella?" When I tried to explain what happened, he didn't believe me. I told him that was God's honest truth. He said to me, "There are no big gorillas in Florida or anywhere else. Now get out of here before I call the police." Well, as you can imagine, I left in a hurry and went straight home and tell my dad. He knew that I was not prone to lying, and frankly, even he was having a hard time swallowing what I had to say. Later that day, he and I drove back over there where this thing had jumped out of the dumpster. We walked over to the can as I described to my dad in detail what had happened. As we walked next to the can, we looked down at exactly where I told him the gorilla had landed, and there were huge impressions in the soil next to the concrete slab. They were 2 large, human-like feet. The impressions were about 2 inches into the dirt. As soon as he saw them, his entire demeanor had changed. He looked at me and then into the woods where I told him it had run. I remember him just shaking his head and saying, "What the heck is a gorilla doing over here?" Anyway, we both got back in the truck and went back home. That apparently was all the proof my dad needed. I told him that it didn't look like any other gorilla in pictures I'd ever seen. It being way too tall and wide than anything I'd seen in the zoo. I called it the monster gorilla, and he just shook his head. This one comes to us from Brian. It was in July of 2015 when a couple of my besties and I were on a hike in the Rocky Mountains on our way to Dream Lake. We were about 4 hours into the trek and were following a meandering trail at some elevation, working our way around an enormous boulder, and from our vantage point, Long's Peak was visible way in the distance. To our left, and falling away from the trail, was a slope covered in some grass, brush, and small pointed pines of many shapes and sizes. As we had just made it around this large boulder, there were several other smaller and flatter rocks that seemed to be inviting us to take a break. So we did. The trail here almost gave the appearance of tan beach sand, in contrast to the surrounding color palette. Just ahead of us, at a distance of about 200 feet, this tan trail wound around a bend and vanished from view. The 3 of us had chosen different spots to cop a squat on 2 different boulders. My back was to the very view that I had just described to you because of where and how I chose to sit, as was my friend Kevin's. Bobby, however, chose to sit on a smaller boulder that was about 10 feet down the slope and facing towards the direction of our heading. I was munching on a couple packages of Belvitas and drinking some Gatorade when Bobby said, "Hey guys, there's something coming." It was about 2 seconds after what he had just said registered in my brain that he then said, "What the heck is that?" Startled, Kevin and I quickly spun around. The three of us were now sitting with our collective eyes fixed on a large, brown figure that had stopped dead in the middle of the trail ahead of us, having just come around the bend. I guess, momentarily, it hadn't registered in Bobby's mind that he was looking at a Bigfoot, because now we were all too well aware of what it was we were seeing. The creature appeared to be equally as shocked as we were from the way it had suddenly stopped and stood there. It was staring right at us and began to rock from side to side. At this point, we'd all gotten to our feet and were looking right at it, I think at a distance of about 125 feet or so, if my memory serves me correctly, as we just faced each other off. What I'm about to say may seem really off the wall, but I'm going to say it anyway, because nobody who listens to this will ever meet me to beat me up about it. In that moment, a deep sense of despair and loneliness started to overwhelm me. It hit me like a spiritual wave, and this feeling wasn't for us, but rather for this creature. I felt as though it was emotionally distraught and wanted to communicate that to us, but it couldn't. There was absolutely nothing aggressive whatsoever about its posture or actions. To me, it was just exuding sadness. What I did next, only a pet lover will understand. But I gently raised my hand and said, "Hello there, we're your friends." I tell you the truth and no lie. In the moment, I didn't have an ounce of fear in me about this creature. I only felt sorrow, as though it badly needed help. And no sooner that I did this, it raised its arms gently and kind of nodded its head, retreating back from where it had come. As soon as it had moved out of sight, my friend Kevin, not knowing how or what I was feeling, said, "That was awful." I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "I felt like I was at a funeral or something. It was like a heaviness was all over me while that Bigfoot was standing there." I told him, "I can't believe you just said that, because all I could feel was a sadness about the thing, and you just confirmed it with your own lips." He said to me, "Yeah, man, it was like it just wanted to talk to somebody and was even more upset that it couldn't." We all slowly walked up to where it had just been and could actually still see it walking back down the trail. As we stood watching, it turned its body one more time to look back at us and disappeared. When I say disappeared, I'm not talking about around a blind corner. I'm talking about it vanished. Like, now you see me and now you don't, if you catch my drift. The three of us just stood there looking at each other and the trail as if to say, "Did we just see that?" What's more weird, seeing a Bigfoot or seeing it vaporize in front of our own eyes? Yet, we had just seen it. I looked down at my feet and could clearly see the prints of what would have been large human-like feet in the sandy surface of the trail. This being that actually had substance to it, having left tracks, had just vanished before our very eyes. I have no explanation for what I've just conveyed to you, nor will I attempt to rationalize the event in any way, shape, or form. You can simply accept it or reject it entirely, and I will understand. As the creature stood in the trail at a fairly close distance to us, it seemed to be almost 7 feet tall, and its shoulders twice as broad as the trail, being some 4 feet or so. It had simply come to a halt upon seeing us and was gently rocking back and forth from the waist up. The hair was somewhat long and brown, and I could see the skin of its chest through its fur. The skin on its face looked like weather-beaten, dark gray. The hands were the same. How is it that something that has form and shape and function can just disappear is beyond me? I really don't expect anyone, frankly, to believe me. Yet, I've told the story again, and now I have told you. Shane begins. This was the craziest damn thing imaginable. If it hadn't happened to me personally, I wouldn't have believed it. I still live and hunt in Tennessee, but I haven't been back into this area that I'm about to tell you about since the day of this incident, and with good reason. Prior to September 14th of 2014, this was one of my all-time best hunting spots, without exception. On this particular day, the forecast was for clouds and drizzle in the morning, with skies clearing in the afternoon. I had hiked in about a half a mile or so to a place where I always left my stand fixed in a tree. In fact, I had just replaced this stand because the old one that was there was getting rusty. That should tell you something in and of itself as to just how fond of this spot I was. This area was comprised of some of the thickest, most tightly packed forest you'll ever navigate. The bushes and trees in here, starting from the ground level, working their way up, were layered in height and density. If not for the occasional game trail, I don't believe that anyone in their right mind would attempt coming in here. But nobody ever said that I was in my right mind. I'd made my way into this spot and was already comfortably sitting in the stand just at the break of dawn. My stand was fixed at the height of about 25 feet, with climbing pins turned into the tree all the way up to it. I'm going to do my best to describe to you exactly where I was sitting and what it was that I could and could not see, as well as telling you why it was that I had chosen this area for my stand in the first place. This patch of forest was what I'd call a depression within a depression. The surrounding area was a valley in between a pair of hills that were around 600 feet in elevation. There was an old, well-used game trail that ran just to the left of my stand and off due north, which was directly in front of me when sitting in the stand. The vast majority of the brush was between 4 and 8 feet tall, which one could by no means hunt in unless you could rise above it and look down on the trail. On most days, and as was the case on this morning, this bowl was filled with a damp, foggy mist that would eventually dissipate, but not until generally around 9 a.m. or later. My sight range from the seat was about 75 feet, at best, in all directions, and then the trees and brush seemed to vanish in the mist. It's a very ethereal thing to sit here alone, and it has even spooked me on more than one occasion. As I was sitting, in hopes of my prey coming down the trail at any moment, I began to hear what I will describe to you as being owls. There were little hoots and screeches coming in succession. It had started as one and then progressed to the point where there were numerous screeches and hoots, all of which were coming from directly in front of me to my north. Being a hunter, it's virtually impossible for me to share with you in a few moments why I say what I'm about to tell you. But the fact of the matter is, and was, that these sounds were not real. In other words, to my trained ear, knowing what the area's owls sound like, how they made their calls, and what time of day they make their calls, I knew these were being faked. Simply put, Something or someone was mimicking the owl calls. One of the most telling aspects was the amount of calls being made, and the fact they were all in one area. The imagination can play some strange tricks on one's mind, especially when you're alone in the midst of such a location. I began to feel a sense of dread, and a cold chill ran down my body, a shiver. At that moment in time, and for the first time since I had been coming in here, which must have been several dozen or more, I was wishing I had brought a gun instead of a bow. I'd never felt this way before. As I just said, it was as though my psychological state was taking a terrible tumble out of control, and there was nothing I could do to control my thoughts and emotions. As if things couldn't get any worse, they did. There was so much hooting and screeching going on that it sounded like a damn war party was going on in the fog right in front of me. The thought had crossed my mind to climb down out of the stand and make my way out. But that thought was countered by that of just staying put, because I would be safer sitting off the ground. My heart was racing. Sweat was actually dripping from my brow. I couldn't believe how frightened I was, and it was escalating. What happened next was beyond belief. If you've never sat in or seen a folding tree stand, I was sitting on the seat portion and my feet were resting on what I'll call the floor of the stand. You can see through the entire stand and its components because it's more of a weave of steel as opposed to being a solid plate, which is done to keep it as light as possible. My back was against the tree, which was maybe 16 inches in diameter, and I was 25 feet or so off the ground, which means that my feet were about 25 feet off the ground. As I sat there, trembling, sweating, and by the way, having seen nothing up until this point, I suddenly felt something grab the heel of my left boot. I immediately jumped to the point of almost falling out of the stand, and as I turned my head to look down to my left, I was staring into the grimacing face of a huge Sasquatch. He was looking directly up at me, having snuck up behind me, and was reaching up with his left hand to grab a hold of my boot. The very moment that I jumped, he let go and just stood there, kind of swaying and watching me. As he stood there, the thought ran through my mind that all of the rest of the activity and noises were just a distraction, which allowed this beast to walk up on me unaware. The thought of putting a broad head right between his eyes was just one of many thoughts that was racing through my mind. I expected at any moment that he was going to grab the foot tray and yank the stand out of the tree and devour me. The size of this thing was unbelievable, and I don't expect you or anyone else to believe me either. He was grabbing my heel with his hand at 25 feet off the ground. You can do the math yourself as to what type of size that equates to. It was just seconds after he had held my heel that he let go. The funny thing was that the grasp was not done with so much, if any, pressure at all. It was as if it wanted me to know that it could do whatever it wanted, including sneaking up on me and touching me. He then turned and walked straight down the trail in front of me. As he did so, all the noises stopped. The woods had suddenly and unexpectedly become dead silent. I think he took about 10 steps to cover about 75 feet and disappeared into the midst of the trees. It was at that moment that I realized I was pissing in my pants. I have no idea why. Call it caused by trauma or whatever you will, but I was peeing in my pants. I leaned with my back against the tree for almost 2 hours in somewhat of a delirium, feeling as though I was on some type of hard narcotic, which had rendered me unable to think or act, and so I sat. I remember looking at my watch at about 9:30 in the morning when I decided to move down the ladder. Everything for me at that moment in time was happening in slow motion. At least, that's the way I perceived it. It seemed as though it took 20 minutes to get down the ladder, after which I sat under the tree for another half hour or so. I was staring down the trail where the Bigfoot had walked away, and I have no idea why. I was in a complete and utter daze. I remember looking at my watch and finally had reached the car when it was almost noon, having begun my morning in the stand only a half a mile from where I parked and began my hike. It was as if, after this encounter, and during it, the time had stood still. Yes, time was still passing, but I was totally and completely disconnected from reality. That week, I called out of work sick for 8 days. It took me that long to recover from this stupor. I went back into this spot many months later after winter had set in, and as I stood beneath the stand, I tried to make some sense of the events that day. I looked up at the seat and visualized him reaching up and grabbing my boot. To do so, he would have had to be 14 or 15 feet tall, with his arm extending beyond that, obviously. His arm would have had to been like 7 or 8 feet long. The game trail was only perhaps 2.5 feet wide at best. And this beast, with its back to me, seemed to be at least 3 times as wide as the trail's width at its shoulders. It had long gray and white hair, with dark gray skin that was visible on its face and hands, as well as the upper chest, and I looked down at it, thinking back. The face seemed to have an incredibly evil smile. But is that how I just perceived him? Perhaps Bigfoot, as they go. He was very handsome and was actually smiling at me. The fact is, he grabbed my boot very gently. He could have easily torn me from my chair and ripped the tree stand out of the tree, and that would have been the end of it. But he didn't. That's what has left me so puzzled. When he was walking away from me, I felt as though anesthesia was taking effect before surgery. That moment in time when you suddenly are drifting off and then you can remember no more. However, I'd taken nothing and had only the encounter to blame on it. It was the most bizarre event of my life, and now you are a part of it. I had just graduated high school the year before and would occasionally head over to the school parking lot to hang out with some of my old friends and chew the fat. My friend, Ernie, had a 1967 Impala Super Sport 396 cubic inch 4-speed. It was blue with a black interior, and he kept this thing up like it was the last car on earth. I was in the school lot this particular day, casually walking around his car, when I noticed a couple of small dents in the driver's door and front fender. The finish on Ernie's car was like glass, and I had never seen any chips, let alone dents in it, so I asked him what happened. He told me that he and his girl, Marianne, were up at the Overlook the other night, and some homeless people were throwing rocks at some of the cars. I told him I'd never heard so much as a homeless person in the entire county in all the days I'd lived there, which was my entire life. He said, "Yeah, they are there, all right. And with the exception of those who don't know any better, nobody is parking there anymore." I thought this was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard and decided to take matters into my own hands, so to speak. At the time, I was driving a 1973 Nova that was in no way, shape, or form in the condition of Ernie's car. That being said, I decided to do a little experiment. This particular parking area was somewhat of an overlook at the end of a dirt path where kids would stop and listen to the radio at night. I'd been there many times in the past, and I had certainly never had any rocks thrown at me. But it had been quiet for some time since I'd last been there. Well, as it were, I had devised a plan to catch these rock-chucking creeps red-handed. I gathered together a few boys, and each week for a month, we were going to park on Friday night at the Overlook. Every Friday, I had 4 guys with me with flashlights and baseball bats. So if someone threw a rock at my car, they were going to get their ass whooped good. On the first 2 Fridays, nothing happened whatsoever, having parked there for almost 3 hours each night. In fact, one night a cop came by and asked what we were doing. And we told him he just rolled his eyes and took off. The 3rd Friday was a rain out, and after an hour we just gave up, figuring no people, homeless or otherwise, would be out in the pouring rain, so we split. It was on the 4th Friday of our stakeout when this whole Bigfoot thing unraveled before our very eyes. We were there in my Nova with the radio on very low, and there was a station wagon about 30 feet from us with a group of kids in it. This happened to be a moonless night, and it was exceedingly dark in this overlooked location. We'd been sitting there for the better part of an hour when we heard a large metallic rap, rap, rap of what sounded like a stone bouncing off the station wagon's hood in conjunction with a girl in the car screaming. My recollection is that it wasn't 10 seconds later when someone said in a loud voice, "There's something standing there with glowing red eyes." On that note, the 5 of us jumped out of the car with our flashlights blazing and ran headlong into the woods. I was the first to step in, with my light pointed directly in front of me, when, standing maybe 20 feet away, was the silhouette of a massive creature with glowing red eyes. They were as bright as the car's headlights shining on a bicycle reflector at night. I yelled out, "Holy beep!" The other guys immediately had put their lights on the same thing. This monster just stood there and didn't as much as flinch. We stood our ground as well. I remember the 5 of us looking back and forth at each other as if to say, what now? This thing, which I now know was a Bigfoot, flexed its arms in what I'll call a bodybuilder pose, turned around and walked into the woods. We had our lights on it the entire time. I remember it staring directly into the lights as though it didn't bother it at all. It had to be every bit of 8 feet tall or more, and was as wide as the back of my Nova's trunk lid. As we started to talk, some of the kids got out of the station wagon and asked us what we'd seen. Eddie said, "It was a damn monster." And Kyle exclaimed, "It was a creature from hell." What we could agree on was that we had seen a large, hairy beast with red glowing eyes, and that it had apparently thrown the rock at the car next to us. Both of these were now facts that we knew were true no matter what anyone else thinks or says. A short while later, we left the scene and actually ran into the officer we had previously seen up there, parked in his car in town. When we told him what just happened, he said, "Why don't we go back up and have a look around? That is, if you're not scared." The fact was, we were afraid, but we weren't going to tell the cop that. So he followed us back up to the Overlook. When we pulled in, he panned the area with his floodlight before we all got out of the car. And when he asked where we had seen the creature, we brought him to the exact spot. As we looked around, he said, Well, look at this. Maybe you kids aren't half crazy after all. He had shown his flashlight pointed directly. He had his own flashlight pointed directly at the ground on what was a large footprint in the peat of the woods. He took his club off his belt and laid it next to it, saying that the print was about 20 inches long and 8 wide. It wasn't that we needed any proof of what we saw, but now the cop was on board after seeing the footprint for himself. He said to us that he didn't know what we had seen, but it was definitely not a bear. He added, "Whatever has a foot that big has to have a body to match." We looked around a little bit more and nothing else came of it. And 2 years later, our family had moved away from the area to New Jersey, but the memory remains until this very day. I often feel the urge to drive back to Ohio and see if the spot is still there. This one comes to us from Wilfredo and Helena. My wife and I were returning home on the interstate one night in December of 2009. This was up in Massachusetts. In the distance, as we were coming up a grade, we saw a semi on the shoulder with its flashers on. As we got closer, there was quite a bit of blood on the pavement and some pieces of debris from the truck, like broken lenses and a mirror lying on the road. We were driving quite slowly as we were approaching the truck and had noticed something on the shoulder, which we believed to be a bear or a moose or something. Suffice to say, it was something very large, and it appeared that it was what had collided with the truck up ahead. We pulled up on the truck and got out. Walking over to the cab, we saw the driver was still inside. I grabbed the side rail and jumped up on the fuel tank to check on the driver. He was sitting in the seat with his head in his hands, still behind the wheel of the truck. I tapped on the window and asked him if he was all right. It took him a few seconds to respond, but he rolled the window down. I could see that he was in shock and didn't answer right away. About a minute later, while I was telling my wife to call the police, he said to me, "I just crashed into a damn Bigfoot that was running across the road back there, chasing a doe." I said to him, "You hit what?" He repeated himself, saying that he had just demolished the front of his truck, hitting a Bigfoot that was crossing the highway. I climbed down from the cab and walked to the front of the truck. The lights were still on, the entire grill, front bumper, and hood was buckled inward. The left front fender and headlamp were demolished. The truck was leaking water from what appeared to be a radiator. It was about 10 minutes later when a trooper came roaring down the highway and an ambulance soon followed. At this time, the driver still had not come out of the cab. He was sitting there in silence, holding his head in his hands. As the trooper drove up, we told him briefly what we knew, and he jumped out to talk to the man. Moments later, a second ambulance came to the scene as well as another trooper. The driver was now out of the truck and talking. About 300 feet behind the truck, an animal was on the side of the road. My wife, Helena, stayed by our car while one of the troopers and I started walking back to it. He had his gun drawn and told me to stay behind him. He said that if the animal's still alive, it may jump up and try to hurt us. The trooper had a powerful flashlight with an expandable beam. I was walking maybe 15 feet behind him as we approached the animal. As soon as the light hit it, I saw the blackened face of a gorilla-type beast with blood pouring out of its mouth. I actually saw one of his eyes blink and his hand move slightly. I knew immediately that this was no moose or anything else that's known in these woods. It's exactly as the driver had said. He had crashed into a Bigfoot with his truck. The trooper told me go back and stand by the truck. As soon as I had reached the truck, he fired 3 rounds at point-blank range into the creature to put him down. A few minutes later, he took a report from us as to what the driver had told us. We overheard as well what the driver was saying to the ambulance crew and the other trooper. He said that he was fairly certain that he was going to hit the deer and was trying all elusive measures in a short period of time not to do so, saying that the trailer brakes had locked up and the trailer had begun to swing wide when all of a sudden this Bigfoot was now squarely in front of the truck and unavoidable. When he said he hit the beast, he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and the impact caused him to fly forward, smashing the windshield with his forehead, which explained to me why he was sitting there in a daze holding his head. But thank God he wasn't cut or bleeding. As we were leaving, the ambulance crew was putting the man in the back of their vehicle. Helena and I took off. And I couldn't help but think, what on God's green earth could be that big that could stop an 18-wheeler in its tracks like that? Well, that beast that was laying on the side of the road was no small thing. And here's Helena's account. I was asking Wilfredo what he had seen because I'd stayed by the car. I saw the trooper fire the shots and only heard the conversations. Wilfredo told me that it was a Bigfoot and it was still alive, but badly bleeding, which was why the trooper had decided to put it down. I said to Wilfredo that I couldn't wait to hear what the news reports would have to say about this the following day. But when the morning had come, there was nothing. We sat by the TV all day, waiting, and nothing at all was said. The next day, Wilfredo actually called the local news station and inquired about not hearing the story. They said they knew nothing about it, nothing about such a story, and asked Wilfredo what he had seen. He must have spent 30 minutes on the phone with them, recounting the entire story. The next day, again, nothing. Nothing was heard or said on the news. Nothing in the local papers the entire week. We both now know what we had seen and heard, and yet not a word was spoken about it. We thought that surely there'd be a great interest in such a story, but it was never told. Well, what is the deal here? We get Bigfoot bodies and is there like some mass conspiracy to cover these things up? Where'd they do it? Where'd they put it? Where'd they go with it? Well, your guess is as good as mine. If you've heard stories like this, drop it down in the comments. I've heard stories, where even military personnel have been called in. I think I read a story on this channel. Military personnel or something of the like was called in to remove a Bigfoot body. I've heard other stories too where Bigfoot were killed and rounded up, and obviously all the evidence was hidden from public. Your guess is good as mine as to why they have to cover this stuff up. Nothing but theories is all I've heard. No real good reasons. Well, anyway, if you've had an encounter with a Bigfoot or anything mysterious, you know what to do. Drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see you in the next one.